fellow Toastmasters and Region Advisor and District Governor. You ain't heard nothing yet. These are the first words of the first talkie, The Jazz Singer, 1927. What's a talkie, you might ask? Well, you may remember a few months ago, if you were here, I gave a speech talking about the development of going from black and white, cinema going from black and white to color. Now what we're talking about today is the transition that cinema made from silent films to sound films, also known as talkies, because they were talking pictures, they had talking. Now first, in the early days of cinema, we had silent movies. Movies were originally silent. That doesn't mean they were watched in silence, but in the theater. In the theater, people would watch the movies. There would be music accompanied with the films, but the music was not synced to the movie. It was, people actually played music on a piano or organ live in the theater while you were watching the music. It must have been pretty cool. I kind of wish I could have seen it. As for sound effects, sometimes sound effects were done live in the theater too, but these didn't come with the movies. The makers of the movies had no control over this. This was just done rapid, just kind of theater-like. It was done in the theater as you're watching the movie live. And some of the advantages of silent films is, well, language. Because you're watching a silent film, people speak. There are titles on the screen. There was a movie from Germany or France, they wanted to show it in America, all they had to do was really change the titles, and then you have the whole movie in a different language. This was actually one of the advantages of silent film. And some of my personal favorite silent films are the German science fiction story, Metropolis. There's a very dramatic film called Sunrise, and all the action comedies of Buster Keaton. I also like Charlie Chaplin, but I like Buster Keaton better. Now, as for when things started to change, things started to change not quite immediately, but more quickly than black and white to color. We talked about, a few minutes ago, I talked about black and white to color. That was a very long process. Silent to sound only took about a decade. In 1923 was the first patent for sound on film system for showing movies with sound in them. But it wasn't until 1927 with The Jazz Singer that we really had our first talkie. So that was 4 years later. And The Jazz Singer was a kind of a partial talkie. It was shot silent in parts, but then in some parts of it they had recorded people speaking and singing, and it was considered the first talkie. After The Jazz Singer, not everyone converted to sound immediately. Some people like silent films better. Most notably, Charlie Chaplin, the kind of famous comedic silent film star. He was still making silent movies. He still made, his last fully silent movie was City Lights in 1931. So he still continues making silence even after the conversion to sound. But he was definitely in the minority. By this point, 1931, by that point, sound films were overwhelmingly popular over silent films. Now the transition from silent to sound was kind of interesting because there were a lot of technical problems as well as advantages. Some of the technical problems included the fact that you had microphones all of a sudden. Microphones in those days, they started with omnidirectional microphones that recorded everything. And they were using this to record speech, but the microphone would also be recording some of the noise on the set at the same time that people are trying to speak. And if you look at some of those early sound films, you'll notice there are a lot of noises that you shouldn't really be hearing, that are not in the movie. It's just noises on the set that made it into the movie. And they tried to cut out as much of that as possible. But it's interesting. Initially, the microphones were omnidirectional, so they recorded everything. Another problem with microphones was that it kind of limited the visual, because if you had to, these microphones were heavy, and technicians would hold the microphones over the heads of the actors who were speaking, and the actors were not so limited, but the camera was limited. And if you take a look at some of the late silent films, look at a film called Sunrise, 1927. It's a really beautiful movie. The camera moves so freely, you wouldn't believe it's an old movie. But this changed when we went from silent to sound, because all of a sudden they were limited by the fact that they had to record sound. They were limited by the microphone, as well as the cameras themselves were quite noisy. So you couldn't have a camera moving around on tracks all the time, and the microphones would be picking that up. So some people kind of regretted this transition to sound at first because of these limitations.